that. So last time we met, we did start this conversation around this notion of freedom. So we were discussing the notion or the concept of freedom. But we did get to agree that we were not going to look at the notion of freedom from a philosophical perspective, but rather from a sociological perspective. In other words, we are not going to discuss freedom in the abstract sense. We're going to discuss freedom in a practical sense. The way human beings get to experience and to live their lives the way they would perceive it to be a free life, where they get to exercise free will as we are supposed to. So the reason why freedom is the topic of today, it is because we were talking about the notion of space and the fact that we human beings live within spaces. And some of the spaces we live in are organized spaces. And these are the kind of spaces we call structures. And because human beings live in structures, and these structures are basically organized spaces, we do not get to do anything we want to do within any given structures. But before we go any further, I have to explain, or we have to make sure we understand the notion of structure. We just said that structures are organized spaces, and structures therefore can be tangible or intangible. Tangible structures are like, for instance, parks, stadiums, classrooms like this one, where you come in and you realize that this is a specific space that has a specific set of expectations, because you come here as a student and you're going to expect to behave, you're going to be expected to behave as a student. And there is a professor in front of you, like me right now, talking to you, and I'm supposed to do what I'm called here to do, namely to teach. So you come here, you expect to have a professor, and the professor is supposed to teach. And the professor comes here, he knows that there are students in classroom, and they are supposed to be partaking in this process of conveying information and understanding, processing knowledge. So, therefore, this particular structure here is a structure within which we interact, but not as we please, but as the structure itself had predetermined. So, the classroom is a space where people don't get to do what they want. People do certain things that are expected of this particular structure. Going back to another example of another kind of structure, namely intangible structures, like the Constitution, or the law itself, or religions. These are another set of structures that happen to be intangible. You cannot touch the Constitution. You can touch the book, but you cannot touch the Constitution. You cannot touch religion. We have Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, and on and on and on. These are religions, and religions are considered to be structures, but only this time they're not tangible structures, but intangible structures. And if you become a member of an intangible structure, just like when you become a student and you go into a classroom to participate in a class, in a lecture, the same behavior that is expected of you as a student is going to be expected of you as a believer if you become a believer of any given religion as an intangible structure. For all Christians, they know that there is a set of expectations, which is what we call commandments. And as soon as you become a Christian, you are expected to behave as such. You cannot do certain things, otherwise they're going to be considered sin or unacceptable, and you are no longer abiding by the terms of the structure. So, which is why we had to explain, before we go any further, this notion of structure, which, as we defined earlier, are organized spaces. And these organized spaces have a set of expectations. And anybody who's a part of the structure, anybody who's a member of the structure, has to abide by the terms, the expectations of the structure. So this is the background this is the context within which we are asking the question, how free are we really as human beings? If we live within structures and these structures have expectations. And considering the fact that there are so many structures out there, considering the fact that human beings belong to a variety of many structures out there, and we did get to call this the complementarity of structures. You can be a Christian belonging to the Christian religion, Christianity. You can also be a U.S. citizen, which puts you within the context of a structure. And you can also be a male. You can also be a student. These are a series of structures to which you belong as a human being, which means we belong to a variety of structures simultaneously. The reason why we're asking the question of freedom is because of the fact that since we belong to a variety of structures, and each one of these structures has a set of expectations, and it just so happens that there are so many of them, one has to wonder, when do we get to exercise free will? When do we get to really be free human beings if everywhere we go there is a structure awaiting us and expecting from us a certain type of behavior? I'm going to simply kind of challenge you now and trying to consider the things you've done since you woke up this morning. And of course, by the time you go to bed later today or tonight, you're going to realize that you've been making a series of decisions, somewhere around 100, 200, or as many as they may be. These are functional decisions. And you may very well realize that for the most part, all the decisions you made, you did not make them because you wanted to make them. Chances are that you made these decisions because you were expected to. And there is going to be a very limited amount of decisions you have made simply because you, as a human being, as you know you are, like you, Jamie, or Kevin, you are simply going to find out that there is only a small window, a few decisions that you made today because you were totally in charge. You decided to make those decisions. You decided the when and how and what. But for the most part, ever since you woke up, you were in the process of making decisions as you are expected to make them, not necessarily as you would have wanted to make them if you were in charge. Beginning with just the simple fact of waking up in the morning. Chances are that when you woke up this morning, you are not the one who decided when to wake up. There is classes to attend, and you knew that in order to be there on time, 8 o'clock, you better wake up at 7 or whenever you really have to wake up in order to be in class on time. So the simple fact of waking up at any given moment, because you know that you are expected to be somewhere at any given time, is in itself an act where you get to pause, not because you have decided totally, but because there is an expectation. And that expectation is put upon you because you are a student, and being a student is belonging to a structure, and the larger structure we are talking about here is going to be belonging to a university, an institution of higher learning. That puts you in the context of structure. And the point, as I said, was now to consider how freely we are, how really free we are, if anywhere we go, there are these structures we have to live up to. And of course, having said that, we now have to go ahead and continue the conversation, elucidating some other aspects of this notion of structure, agency, and freedom. And the end goal, of course, as we go through a number of many other segments, it is to allow us later on at the end of the week to get into this discussion about freedom, socially speaking. But we can only get deeper into the conversation after we have elucidated a variety of aspects of what structures are about. So therefore, let's go ahead again and visit some of the additional segments that are going to help us understand and discuss deep in our discussion later. So structures are inert without agency, and this is where we're going to talk about this rapport, the relationship between structure and agency. And we have to realize that you can have structures out there, but they're going to be without any life if there are no people acting within. And the people who act within structures are what we call agents, and this is why we have this segment here called structure and agency. Structures are inert without agency. Colleges without students are simply unthinkable. Churches have to have believers. The military, as an institution, as a structure, needs to have the soldiers, otherwise you don't have the army. So, in the end, the question is, what is agency? And in this particular segment, agency is simply about the ability to act and to decide. So the segment here wants to make sure that we understand that every structure has agents, and agents are the people who get to make decisions within structures. And the definition here can be found from the book by Flint on geopolitics. And of course, those who act and decide are agents, as we have just established. And having said that, we have to move on further to this, what I would call the consequence of this relationship between structure and agents. And this is the segment I call structure's domination of agency. Although they create structures, agents must submit to the demand of structures. Human beings are the ones who create structures. Human beings are the ones who have created this institution of higher learning, SUNY. Human beings are the ones who create religion, Islam, you name it. Human beings are the ones who create government. Human beings are the ones who came up with the Constitution. So all the structures you can think of, both tangible and intangible, are created by human beings. In another context, one would use the term construed. Constructivism talks about the fact that we are responsible of all things unnatural. And structures, of course, are unnatural. They are created by human beings, and therefore they are the ones who create structures. But the paradox is that although we create structures, we as human beings, we have in the end to submit to the demands of structures. Because in order for these structures to live up to the raison d'etre, the reason why we create them, they have to function in a certain way. If you create an institution of higher learning, it is because you are interested in producing informed young people capable of contributing to society, of becoming contributing members of society. So if that is the goal of higher education, or education in general, you're going to have to run higher education in a way that allows you to produce students who are now knowledgeable of some of the areas that expect them to be active in. So in the end, every structure has to function in a certain way, and because structure has to function in a certain way, they have rules, regulations, laws, they have eligibility criteria, they have commencement, and on and on and on, because they cannot just function openly without any kind of rhythm. And they need this is because they have a mission to fulfill. So we are even socialized to fit the mold. We as human beings, since we are born, our parents at least are aware of the fact that we live within a society that is made of structures. And we are prepared to be members of society that fit in these structures. Therefore, we are even socialized to fit in these particular structures and to therefore be able to carry on what these structures are about. So these demands may be harmless. In other words, the demands that structures end up putting upon us, because structures themselves have to function a certain way. So some of the structures that some of the demands that structures put upon us are, for the most part, harmless, because religions are going to expect from their believers not to sin. Not to sin is an expectation that put upon you as a believer from your religion. Countries, nations, states expect from the citizens to follow the law. So the state is a structure, and it puts demands on the citizens, namely to follow the law. So these are demands expressed and articulated by structures which can be categorized as harmless. And of course, you could come up with a variety of many other examples of what constitute harmless demands of structures. So they may, however, be consequential. In other words, you may find out that demands from structures that do have a certain degree of consequence, and sometimes these consequences are really, really not negligible. In other words, they are serious enough to make us think. And this is a few examples I'll submit to you. Consider the following cases. Eventually, you may become a part of a structure whose demands are consequential, up to the point where they may ask you to kill. And then you may find yourself in a situation where you kill in the name of a structure, because that particular structure has a demand or demands that are consequential. We end up killing in the name of structures. And a few examples, as you can read there, is honor killing. You should be familiar with that particular example, which is a reality in Islamic cultures. But it has also become a reality everywhere where Muslims live. Not everywhere all the time, but eventually every now and then you do hear cases or situations like this. Like here in the US, not too long ago, we did have a case of honor killing in Michigan. And it is a phenomenon that I don't need to explain any further, where you get to kill somebody who somehow has dishonored your family, culturally or religiously. This is, as I said, a phenomenon that usually happens in Islamic societies. So, ethnic cleansing or genocide, these are other types of consequences that happen simply because somebody is acting in the name of a structure. If you belong to a certain ethnic community, that is a structure to which you belong. And then you may be called upon to do certain things simply because you belong to that particular structure. The genocide, you may become a member of the Nazis, National Socialism in Germany, and that is going to be a reason why you end up trying to exterminate the Jewish population. Or you may be a member of the Hutu in Rwanda, which is this country in Africa, and then you may find yourself in a situation where political contest situation compel you to do harm to somebody who may not belong to your ethnic community. Gangs are another example that we may be much more familiar with here. We have harakiri in Japan, where the samurais, whenever they've done some things that were not acceptable to the caste of the samurai, the outcome was simply to take their own lives, and then they would do what is known as harakiri or bushido. There is a variety of terms for that particular phenomenon. And these are a few examples where structures' demands are compelling and consequential up to the point where we start to do things that are almost unimaginable. We die in the name of structures. Additionally, a number of other cases and examples where you do find people doing things in the name of structures because structures have put upon them these demands. So we die in the name of structures. Islamic martyrs and the jihad. This is a concrete example of how you end up doing things in the name of a structure because the structure expects that of you. If you are a Muslim, you may be asked, depending on which brand of Islam you practice or which kind of interpretation of Islam you subscribe to. There is a kind that subscribe to this consequential application of the notion of jihad, which eventually leads to the need to do certain things in the name of Islam, and that would qualify whoever does that to martyrdom. And you end up with another example of what we call a consequential expectation or demand of a structure. We fight in the name of structures. The soldiers, those in the military, they end up fighting wars, not necessarily because them individually, any given soldier individually, not because he or she wants to fight that war, but because he or she is a member of a structure, an element within the structure, and the structure is the military. And whenever the military has to fight a war, that particular individual has to go fight the war as well, which is an example of, an additional example of how we end up fighting in the name of structure. Al-Qaeda, the US, these are structures, and we have antagonism about these two antagonist actors, but it is basically because of the expectation of each one of the structures we have there. There are even the cases where we hate in the name of structures. Right now in the US, it has been in the news a number of times. The members of a specific church, which is the Westboro Baptist Church, these are people who eventually end up doing some hateful things simply because their structure, the structure to which they belong, demands that particular behavior from them. And then, of course, in the end, another segment, all of these segments are preparing us to have this meaningful conversation, discussion at the end of the week. And another one of the last segments is entitled Structures as Causes of Issues. So we end up eventually creating a civilization that relies on structures, but these structures themselves may become problematic because they may become themselves the cause of why we end up producing wars, conflict in society, in civilization, not because we want to, but because of the demands of structures we have created. Which is why I just simply going to evoke the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is a Swiss-French or a French-Swiss philosopher of the Enlightenment era. He's the one who has this particular claim, and the claim is simply that we as human beings, before we belong to any structure, before we become socialized in a way that society believes to be civilized, we are simply organically good and sincere and honest and simple human beings as nature has intended. But as soon as we become members of structures, these structures start corrupting us. We become affected by the expectations and the ideologies of the variety of structures we belong to. And in the end, Rousseau is going to say, the natural human being who is a good person has been corrupted by all these structures, because these structures usually have expectations, and these expectations are created and designed by human beings, and knowing that human beings are selfish, are greedy, are imperfect, you can only expect that they, whatever they design as demand, may not necessarily be all that holy. Which is why we end up with this claim by Rousseau that we should move away from all these civilized structures we create, because they end up producing problems. They become the causes of some of the problems we have. Structures are humans' invention or inventions, and then of course they are the result of civilizations. But if we fight, kill, hate, die, and antagonize others, it is because of civilizations we have created. Because in the cases, using the cases we've just gone over, we did find ourselves in a situation where some would kill, some would fight, some would hate, some would die in the name of these structures. But these structures are creations of our civilization. And therefore, Rousseau says, they are the ones that lead us to committing this act, and they are, in the end, the cause of these bad things. One would end up asking, at least I do ask the question to you, was Rousseau right? Just keep the question in mind. We're going to continue the conversation on Friday, and we're going to have to answer that particular question. Then moving on, as soon as the slides allow me, we have another example of those who believe that yes, indeed, sometimes structures, instead of helping us, get in the way of human peaceful coexistence. I do have here a text by the legendary singer of the Beatles, who was John Lennon. And in one of his texts, in one of his songs, Imagine, this is what he wrote. Imagine there is no countries. It is hard to do. Nothing to kill or to die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say, I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us. And of course, this is an exhortation by John Lennon to compel us, to ask us, to dare us, to challenge us, to think of a world that would be designed without any structures to keep us from doing the things the way, as Rousseau would say, nature intended. Of course, and I can see in your faces that you may disagree with both Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Lennon, and this is going to be, whatever you can think of, whatever you come up with, is going to be part of the conversation you're going to have on Friday. But just do think about what John Lennon said. You may actually find some sense into it, and of course, you may also believe that it is a little too idealistic, a little too utopian. And of course, we're going to discuss that on Friday. Because we agreed that we were not going to have a give and take kind of question and answers, we simply decided to wait until the conversation started, namely the discussion, to have all the necessary questions asked, and then we would move on to have a discussion. And during this discussion, I'm going to simply want to hear from you, your reaction, your thought, whatever has kind of sparked any thought, any reaction of any kind from you since we started covering this particular topic, which is about the fact that we human beings live in structures, and because structures have expectations, and because there are so many of them out there, one has to wonder, when do we get to exercise free will? And if there is a question asked about our ability to fully take advantage of free will, one has to ask further whether we are really free or not. And remember, as we were saying earlier, this conversation is not philosophical, it's not an abstract conversation about the notion of freedom, but it is rather sociological, about the reality we encounter every day as we exist. Do we get to freely, unrestricted, do, say, act the way we please, or do we find ourselves limited in so many ways? And in addition, is the fact that we are limited in so many ways a bad thing to society, or there is a profound and logical, and necessary reason why there are those restrictions to our individual free will. And in the end, of course, we're going to have to decide whether the notion of freedom may simply be overrated. In other words, could we imagine a world where human beings voluntarily decided to cut down on their freedom because they're interested in some other things? You might have thought already about this particular question, namely, why do we have these structures? And how come do we still feel free even though we live within these structures? It is because these structures exist to help us reach other goals. In other words, next to freedom, there are other goals in society. It is what sociologists call social goods. Freedom is a social good, but freedom is not the only social good. Other social goods are like justice. Justice is another social good. So next to freedom, you have justice. And another social good would be simply peace. Is another social good, or security, if you will. Another social good would be prosperity. So we do have a variety of social goods out there, and it seems like whenever we are interested in one of these social goods, we may be willing to cut down and to limit our own freedom. And a concrete example would be the fact that whenever somebody needs a job and realizing that the job is what they need the most, they may end up taking the job, even though that particular job cut into their capacity to exercise free will. In other words, you may get a job that asks you to wake up in the morning or wake up in the night if you have a night shift. You may want to sleep, but you can no longer sleep. Or you rather do something, go someplace other way, or you may want to do some other things as part of exercising your free will. But if you decide that making money is more important than being free out there, this is a concrete example where you trade off freedom for something else. And in this particular case, you have a concrete example of how other social goods may trump freedom, and it may be the reason, the explanation to the equation, to this particular fact that we end up sometimes in so many ways voluntarily cut down on our own freedom because we are in pursuit of other things. One last example before we close, we stop today, is love. You may fall in love, you may meet somebody, start dating, fall in love, go and stay alone, and decide to get married. But getting married in itself a reality that undermines in so many other ways the ability of any of the partners to be totally free, because you're committed to some other person, another person, and that in itself, that particular act restricts your freedom. You can no longer do all the things you want to do because there's somebody else to take into account, but yet you don't feel necessarily deprived of your freedom because you feel happy to be in love with somebody you love. And this is a case where love as a social good trumps very much freedom, and it is maybe the explanation, the reason why we don't mind so much being restricted by all these structures, if these structures somehow allow us to get access to some other social goods that are out there. And with that in mind, we're going to stop, and we continue this conversation on Friday, where I'm going to be the one who listens more to what you have to say about everything you have heard since the beginning of the semester, the beginning of the week, right? All right. Thank you for today.